Sırada Profesör Doktor Merih Celasun'un Anma Dersi var. Dersi verecek olan Sayın Daron Acemoğlu'nun kısa özgeçmişini sizlerle paylaşmak istiyorum. Daron Acemoğlu 1967 yılında İstanbul'da doğdu. Galatasaray Lisesi'ni bitirdikten sonra yüksek öğrenimini York Üniversitesi ve London School of Economics'te tamamladı. 1992-93 yıllarında LSE'de, 1993 yılından itibaren de MIT'de dersler veren Acemoğlu, çalışmalarında politik ekonomi, büyüme ve kalkınma, teknoloji, gelir ve ücret eşitsizlikleri, kurumsallaşma, çalışma ekonomisi ve son yıllarda hızla gelişen şebeke ekonomileri üzerine yoğunlaştırmıştır. Onun üzerinde ödülü bulunan ve en çok alıntı yapılan 10 ekonomistten biri olan Acemoğlu, National Bureau of Economic Research, Center for Economic Performance, International Growth Center ve Center for Economic Policy Research ile birlikte çalışmalar yürütmektedir. 2 defa Nobel ödülüne aday gösterilen saygın ekonomist, dünyanın en prestijli ödüllerinden olan en iyi genç ekonomist ödülü John Bates Clark madalyasına da layık görülmüştür. Bunun yanı sıra pek çok bilimsel dergide yardımcı editörlük deneyimine sahiptir ve saygın iktisadi derneklerde üyeliği bulunmaktadır. 3 kitabı bulunan Acemoğlu, James Robinson'la birlikte yazdıkları son kitabı Why Nations Fail, Origins of Power, Poverty and Prosperity hakkında bu önemli günde bizlere bir ders verecek. Dersi İngilizce olacak, arkadaşlarım size yardımcı olacaklar kulaklık konusunda. Şimdi sözü Sayın Daron Acemoğlu'na bırakıyorum.
Çok teşekkürler. TEPAV'a, Güven Sakbey'e ve benden önce konuşan herkese çok teşekkür ediyorum. Ne yazık ki ben Merih Celasun hocayla tanışma fırsatı bulmadım. Türkiye dışında eğitimimi yaptığım için Türkiye'deki en önemli iktisatçılarla da bazen tanışma fırsatı olmuyor. Yine de tabii iktisada başladığımdan kısa süre sonra ismiyle karşılaştım ve yazdığı birçok eseri okuma fırsatım oldu bu zaman içinde. Ve onu anma, ona saygı gösterme gününde burada olduğum için çok memnunum. Ben James Robinson'la yazdığımız Why Nations Fail kitabı hakkında biraz konuşmak istiyorum. Program ders diyor. Aslında ders değil, biraz daha konuşma gibi ve sonunda da soru cevap kısmında da sizin düşüncelerinizi, sorularınızı tabii ki dinlemek çok istiyorum. Birçok kelimeyi teknik olarak alıştığım için bunu Türkçe vermek zor olacak. Onun için ben İngilizce konuşacağım. Tabii soru cevapta isterseniz Türkçe ya da isterseniz İngilizce sorabilirsiniz soruları. Kusura bakmayın. Şimdi İngilizceye switch edeceğiz. Just to warm up, let me say thank you first also. So I'm going to say a few words about what James and I have done in this book, what our purpose was, a little bit of the argument. I don't mean to summarize the book. It's almost 500 pages, and obviously I don't feel qualified to summarize it in such a short speech. But I want to give you a sense of the argument and how it relates to a variety of things that you might have thought about or encountered. The book is very non-technical. Its purpose is to bring a body of work that James and I have contributed to over the last 15 years. We met almost 17, 18 years ago now, and have been working on more or less these topics for all that time. And when we started, many of the things that we're talking about in this book, are building on the shoulders of giants. But when we started thinking about these issues, at the end, economic growth, the study of why some countries are rich and have grown for long periods of time and some haven't, was a purely economic topic. And that, of course, is befitting for a topic that's at the core of economics. But one of the things that struck us is that if you want to understand why some countries are prosperous and are able to grow, the questions are always related to the policies and institutions that countries adopt. And the answers are deeply interwoven with the politics of it. So from the get-go, we started thinking about economic development and economic outcomes in the context that did not ignore politics. And that was a sort of a long journey. And essentially, the book is a reflection of that journey. It's trying to sort of bring many of the lessons of that journey together in a form that's sort of accessible. And the questions that we're trying to tackle here are actually, as old as economics itself, or even perhaps older. In fact, Adam Smith's Wealth of Nation, which sort of defined the field of economics, was explicitly about the wealth of nations, understanding why some nations are wealthy and some aren't. And sort of the noteworthy thing is that actually when Adam Smith was writing, the richest country in the world was probably 4 or 5 times as rich as the poorest. Since then, the economics as a discipline has made enormous progress. But the topic that really sits at its core, understanding the wealth of nations, has become harder. As the world has become more integrated, more globalized, more unified, the gaps that separate the rich and poor countries have actually grown. Today, the gap between the richest and the poorest country, depending on how you measure it, is certainly over 40-fold. It might be as large as 60-fold. So these are tremendously jarring differences. So what accounts for the emergence of such huge differences and why they have remained persistently in the face of policies and interventions and all of this globalization, integration, and trade? Of course, with such a central question for economics, many people have come up with theories and approaches. Some have argued, and still argue, about the importance of environmental factors, geographic factors, climate, natural resources, location, and those matter. Some have argued about culture, the values that determine how hard a country works, how it approaches innovation, how closed is it to new ideas. And others, perhaps the most dominant paradigm in economics, have implicitly subscribed to a view that sort of puts policy at the center, but policy led by enlightened leadership. So the argument goes, some countries have the right leaders, or they have leaders that have advisors that understand what the right solutions are, and some don't. And as countries make such decisions, economic gaps emerge between them. So when you look at the current mess that the United States and Europe and the world economy is in, some people will say, oh, look at all of the mistakes that Germany is making, or look at all of the mistakes that the United States is making. And the story sort of underlying it is, Paul Krugman or X and Y would tell, if you only listen to me or if you only listen to my advice, things will be much better. The economy is going to grow faster, unemployment is going to fall, and so on and so forth. And that sort of perspective is also natural in economics, because as economics, what we teach our students is exactly, find market failures, think about how we can redress them, what's the cleverest way of going around improving the allocation of resources, and so on and so forth. But actually, this book comes from the realization that all of these factors that I have just listed are really second order. It's not that they're unimportant entirely, but they're really not that useful for understanding these huge differences that we observe. Instead, understanding the differences that surround us in the world economy, we argue, is not that difficult. It comes down to what we call institutions. Institutions are a broad term, and you have to make it much more specific, but essentially institutions are the things that determine the rules of the game, the sort of formal and informal regulations that surround us in every sphere of life. In particular, economic institutions, if they encourage investment and innovation and create a level playing field so that people can deploy their talent, their comparative advantage in an efficient way, are pretty effective at bringing prosperity. Those sorts of economic institutions we call inclusive. Now, if it is indeed pretty straightforward that prosperity is related to inclusive economic institutions, how come there is so much poverty around us in the world economy? And our answer, which is the central part of the book, is that actually inclusive institutions may be good for economic growth, for prosperity in the long run, but most societies throughout history, and even today, are not ruled by inclusive economic institutions, but by extractive economic institutions. Extractive economic institutions are those that don't create secure property rights for the mass of citizens. They're the ones that do not create a level playing field. They advantage a small group of society and disadvantage the rest. They create entry barriers protecting the businesses of some groups. They go much further than that, as I'll talk about a little bit in the rest of the talk. They use coercion and other methods in order to affect the distribution of economic gains in society for the advantage of some segments of society. So the question is, why are extractive institutions the norm throughout history and today? And there, the clue is already in the term. The extractive economic institutions, as the word extractive suggests, are there for a purpose. They're not there by mistake, they're there by design. They have been designed so that the politically powerful, whom we call in the book the elite, it's a broad term, thank you, benefit from the extraction. If they create a non-level playing field, it is the elite that benefits, and it's at the top of that tilted playing field. If they create regulations that prevent entry, it's the elite that owns the businesses. Or if they create an environment in which property rights are violated or there is coercion in the economic sphere, it's often the elite that is the beneficiary of those. So that's what makes politics central to this endeavor. So hence, it's meaningful that this is an economic and political research institute here. Politics is central because it is politics that determines who has political power in society and how that political power can be wielded. What sort of constraints does that encounter when it's exercised? Because it is, after all, that political power that enables the elite to construct these economic institutions and to use them for their benefit, even if they don't benefit society. Hence, you really have to think about not just economic institutions, but also political institutions. Political institutions are those that determine how political power is exercised, how it's distributed, whether we have political equality or political inequality in society, whether we have checks and balances or not. And those political institutions are in a symbiotic relationship with economic institutions. They need to be in such a way that they support the economic institutions. In particular, we call those that generally support inclusive economic institutions, inclusive political institutions, and those that support extractive economic institutions, extractive political institutions. Of course, at this level, this is a little abstract, and I've told you, after all, one particular theory, and I've claimed, this one explains a lot, and the alternatives are secondary. Well, why should you believe me? Well, one way I can try to convince you is suggest that you read the book, but, that's not the point of giving a talk. So what I'm going to try to do is it's not as rich as going through several case studies in history or looking at the actual data. But what I'm going to do is I'm going to go through one specific illustration to try to develop the argument of why what I've said is central is actually pretty important, and also show you why alternative perspectives are not that useful. Though it's a one specific case, as you'll see, it is going to be quite clear that as we go through it, you'll see that it shares a lot of commonalities with many other historical episodes. And to do that, I'm going to turn to the Americas. Of course, sitting here, it would have been better perhaps to talk about the Ottoman Empire and the Turkish Republic and the current days of Turkey. But the Americas, the New World, so to speak, is a particularly good case for understanding what makes institutions tick and what the role of institutions is in long-run economic development. And it also makes it pretty apparent why alternative perspectives are not going to be that useful. After all, institutions in the Americas, as in many other parts of the world, but really very clearly in the Americas, have been shaped by the process of European colonization. The institutions that we see around the American continent, in the north, in the south, in the center, in the Caribbean, they're all continuation in one way or another of the institutions that developed, emerged, and got rooted after the process of Europeans colonizing the continent. So, to do that, let's turn to the early stages of colonization, to South America. Many of you are probably familiar with the colonization of the Aztecs and the Incas by Cortés and Pizarro, the famous Spanish conquistadors. But let me start by a slightly less well-known conquistadors, Juan Díaz de Solís, who, even before the colonization of the Aztecs, started the colonization of what is today Uruguay and Argentina. In 1516, he landed in that part of the continent with a group of Spanish conquistadors. And though not as famous as Cortés and Pizarro, his remit and his strategy were exactly those that would later be perfected by Pizarro and Cortés. In particular, he was there to find precious metals, gold and silver, and to capture Indians and put them to work to produce food and to mine those precious metals. And the objective was, of course, the enrichment of the conquistadors themselves and the Spanish crown, which became later a major beneficiary of all of these colonization process. But differently from the Aztecs and the Incas, what de Solís encountered at the beginning of the 16th century in that part of the continent was not a major, large, settled civilization, but bands of hunter-gatherer Indians, very sparsely settled. In particular, Charruas and the Querandi were all very sparsely settled, very mobile, very small bands of Indians. And also, notably, they did not have hierarchy. Hierarchy, though not unheard of among hunter-gatherers, is fairly rare, and it doesn't have the same level of hierarchical society with elites and lower strata in these mobile hunter-gatherer societies that you would see in the sedentary societies. No matter, the Spaniards went about their strategy. They tried to capture the Charruas and the Querandi. They tried to put them to work, but to no avail. First of all, they were very difficult to capture because it was a vast terrain and very few of them existed. Second, they were very mobile, difficult to capture. And third, even when captured, they refused to work and fought the Spaniards, partly because they could, their mobility enabled them, but partly also because they weren't used to that sort of agricultural or mining work given the way that their society was organized. In particular, the Spaniards couldn't just capture a city or a bunch of villages and coerce existing coerced laborers, because such coerced labor didn't exist. So Spaniards were totally unprepared to produce food for themselves. So they started starving. De Solis himself was clubbed to death shortly thereafter. So this was a huge failure, and that's why you probably don't know De Solis and you know Pizarro and Cortez. So totally desperate and about to throw the towel in, de Mendoza, one of the other conquistadors, started another expedition up the river there from where Buenos Aires is, the Parana River, that goes to what is today Asunción, Paraguay. So when they went up there, they found another band of Indians. Now, these weren't the Incas or the Aztecs either, but they were a little more settled. They were a little more densely settled. They were already sedentary, and very importantly, they already had developed some sort of hierarchy. So these Guarani Indians were a little bit more of the sort of proposition that the Spaniards were sort of after. And in fact, they were very successful in capturing them. What they did is that they took over the existing Guarani institutions. They declared themselves as the elite. They married some of the princesses, and they put the existing Guarani institutions to work, and they started designing different institutions in order to coerce the existing population to do the food production and to hopefully mine valuable minerals, although it turned out that weren't that many of them. And that was the beginning of the successful colony that became Paraguay, and you can see many of the institutional features of the Paraguayan economy today are still remnants of that colonization expedition. In fact, the sort of institutions that the Spaniards started developing around this time were going to be widely adopted in the rest of the continent. Encomienda, which was a land grant that came with labor coercion because the labor together with land was also granted. So it was essentially a servile form of labor. Systems of coerced labor, which would labor be perfected in the mines of Peru and Bolivia, the Mita system, for example, that sort of coerced labor started from the beginning. And those are clear example of what I've just called extractive institutions. The Spaniard designed them in order to get as much food out of the Indians, as much output out of the Indians, and putting their wages down as much as possible. No wonder that the Indians often starved and worked from overwork, and there was a huge population collapse also, aided by the germs that the Europeans brought, to which the native populations did not have immunity. This sort of gives you a sense of how the colonization of South America started. What about the North? Now, the classic story of North America often talks about the Puritans, how the Puritans fleeing religious persecution in England or Europe sort of went there, and it was a very different society because it was based on British culture. Perhaps it was based on Protestant culture as opposed to the Catholic practices that the Spaniards did. Perhaps it was very much more liberty-loving because people were fleeing repression at home. Actually, there is some Puritan colonies, but if you look at the pattern of early colonization, it doesn't look very much like what the classic sort of conventional wisdom agrees. In fact, most telling is the colony of Jamestown, which started in 1607, very early in the 17th century, by the Virginia Company. The Virginia Company was one of these many companies that formed in England at this time as a profit-making venture, chartered by the king, so not that different from what the conquistadors were doing. But more remarkable is that the model of colonization that the Virginia Company had, when it sent 3 ships to what is Jamestown in Virginia today, it was remarkably similar to what the Spaniards were doing. They were after making money. It was a profit-making enterprise for themselves and for their king. How are they going to make money? Well, they were going to make it out of gold and silver and putting other people to work. It is telling that in these 3 ships, there were 2 types of people. There were goldsmiths and soldiers. That's it. There were no farmers. They were not thinking of growing food for themselves. They needed they needed military men for the coercion, and they needed goldsmiths because they were going to find gold. That was what motivated the Virginia Company. So they landed, and they went about their business of trying to colonize the place. But things worked out, not only their objectives and their way of going about it, but the details actually worked out remarkably similar to what happened 80 years ago 90 years ago, in Argentina and Uruguay. They encountered very sparsely settled, very mobile, hunter-gatherer societies, tried to capture them, didn't work, tried to trade with them, that didn't work that much either, so they started starving. Almost all of them died, just like the Spaniards, but there was one crucial difference. The Spaniards could go up the river and find a more densely settled place, just the sort of proposition they were after, and more importantly, they could go and find the Aztecs and the Incas and the remnants of the Mayas. No such luck for the Virginia Company. There were no densely settled populations. There were no sedentary empires in that part of the continent. So they threw in the towel and they said, okay, our strategy of capturing the Indians and putting them to work is not going to work. So what did they do? They came up with a second strategy. Their second strategy was, okay, fine, we cannot put the Indians to work. We should bring our own lower strata and we should put them to work instead. So the Virginia Company started the indentured servitude system, where poor people from Europe would be brought back in an idyllic for them anyway, for the elites, manorial system which was based on the feudal system that had already disappeared in England. And these people would do the production. They would be coerced to do the production on the terms that was attractive for the elites and the captains of the governors of the Virginia Company, and the Virginia Company shareholders in England and the elite in the New World would make money. Just to give you a sense, let me read you a piece from the laws that were passed during this time by the governor, Sir Thomas Gates, and his deputy, Sir Thomas Dale. So it goes like this. No man or woman shall run away from the colony to the Indians upon pain of death. Anyone who robs a garden, public or private, or a vineyard, or who steals ears of corn, shall be punished with death. No member of the colony will sell or give any commodity of this country to a captain, mariner, master, or sailor to transport out of the colony or for his private use upon pain of death. Now, when you read this, you realize two things. This was a very coercive colony. Pretty much anything you did was punishable by death. Steal an ear of corn, or think about stealing an ear of corn, you were sent to the gallows. But secondly, there was a reason why there was so much coercion. They were trying to deal with a real problem, and the real problem was that after they brought in the indentured servants, the incentives of the servants was not very much in line with the objectives of the Virginia Company. They were now upon this open frontier, this vast fertile land. They could run away to the Indians, trade with the sailors, just go and start producing themselves away from the soldiers of the company. And they were trying to stop that. That's why trading with anybody else is punishable by that, because if you trade with them, then I cannot take away what you've produced. No matter what the threats were, it didn't work. Just the environment was not conducive for the Virginia Company to be able to set up the sort of repressive production system that they wanted to do. So finally, 11 years after the inception of the colony, in 1618, the Virginia Company said, okay, fine, our second strategy is not working also, and we're going to try something entirely different. Something entirely different was a headright system. In the headright system, they said, okay, fine, coercing the Indians doesn't work, coercing the settlers doesn't work, so what we're going to do is we're going to try to give incentives to the Indians. In the headright system, they would give land to the Indians, and they would, to the settlers, and they would say, fine, from now on, you have secure property rights to this plot of land. You can produce whatever you want. In Virginia, that was going to be tobacco. But you can produce whatever you want. You can sell it. You can trade with anybody else. And you can just enrich yourself within the auspices of the Virginia Company. Now, the problem with the headright system may not be obvious at first. You might say, well, this headright system sounds great. Isn't that like the inclusive institutions that you were talking about? Secure property rights gives incentives for investment. You can invest because I give you secure property rights. You're going to do whatever production you want. No coercion. Any settler is entitled to this plot of land. So that all sounds good. These are inclusive economic institutions. But there's only one glitch. Can you really trust the Virginia Company? Just a year ago, they were threatening you to kill. They were threatening you with death in case you traded with anybody. And now suddenly you're supposed to have secure property rights. Well, the settlers were a little skeptical. And the Virginia Company in 1619, just a year after the headright system, had to do something else. They said, fine, we also give you political power. So they introduced the General Assembly, and they said, from now on, it's not the Virginia Company, it's not the shareholders back in London, it's not the Governor Sir Thomas Gale and Sir Thomas Gates who are going to call the shots, but you yourself decide in the General Assembly what the policies are. And that, in the same way as the encomienda and the mita and all of these gamut of extractive institutions were the beginning of the Latin American institutions, were the beginning of the North American institutions. Now, remarkably, the Virginia Company did not survive, Jamestown Colony did not survive, but the same sort of events repeated in many other parts of the continent, and the same sort of outcome got realized. In all of these places, the plans of the elites to create extractive economic and political institutions didn't work, and they had to grant inclusive economic and political institutions. And those inclusive economic and political institutions survived and became the basis of the broadly more inclusive economic and political institutions in the United States. When did that big divergence that I talked to at the beginning happen? It didn't happen overnight. As I said, in the 18th century, the gap was much smaller than today. It happened mostly in the 19th century and early 20th century. It happened as new technologies, in particular related to industrialization, spread around the world, but only in some parts of the world. Only in the parts of the world that were open to industrialization, embraced it with open arms, and those were the parts that had broadly more inclusive institutions. In particular, in parts of the world where the institutions were extractive, the enthusiasm for industrialization was severely limited. And as a result, the world got more and more divided into rich and poor. The United States industrialized, but Bolivia or Peru didn't. Mexico did so much, much later and much, much more slowly. That's all we argue and try to document is an outcome of these extractive institutions. To get a sense about why is it that extractive institutions are so inimical to industrialization, to economic growth, let's turn a little closer to home, to Europe in the 19th century. Perhaps, what happens in North America, what happens in the Americas is too foreign. Caribbean, there may be lots of other things wrong. But actually, within Europe, you see a big divergence in the 19th century also. The Ottomans did not industrialize. The Austro-Hungarians did not industrialize. The Russians did not industrialize. England, France did. Later on, Germany did. So why? Well, again, looking at history gives us many clues. Let's look at Russia and Austria-Hungary, or we can look at the Ottomans also. In all three of these cases, when opportunities for industrialization came, the attitude of the elites was very hostile. Of course, all three of these societies are perfect exemplars of extractive institutions. Very centralized power, without any checks, very unequally distributed. Extractive political institutions, and economic institutions highly regulated, highly tilted to benefit the power holders, extractive economic institutions. So when people came up with the idea of bringing in factories or bringing railways to Austria-Hungary, Francis I, the emperor, said, no way, not over my dead body, because, he said, factories, those are going to bring the dreaded revolution to Austria-Hungary. To him, both railways and factories were dangerous things. The main threat that he foresaw wasn't that they wouldn't be good for the Austro-Hungarian economy, but it was that building factories was going to lead to political power shifting away from the emperor and from the feudal lords that were his main support group to new industrial groups, or lo and behold, to the workers. And that would bring the dreaded revolution to Austria-Hungary, and he would prevent that. So throughout Francis I's life, there were almost no railways built in Austria-Hungary, while there was a frantic railway building boom going on in many parts of the world, the United States included, Western Europe included. And the same thing happened in Russia. In Russia, Nikolai I, the Tsar, had exactly the same attitude to railway and factories, and he also blocked them explicitly. And of course, this wasn't an idle fear. Nikolai I was right. After he died, and after the Crimean War, when Russia was defeated by the Ottoman Empire, France, and the United Kingdom, it concluded that it had to industrialize defensively for military reasons, and there was a frantic pace of industrialization and railway building in Russia in the last quarter of the century. And what happened to show that Nikolai I wasn't totally off the mark, that was followed by the 1905 and the 1917 revolutions. And that is the crux of the matter. The key fear of elites is that if they allow extractive institutions to turn away towards more inclusive institutions or economic growth to go apace, that's going to create political tensions, and in particular, it's going to destabilize their power. And because their control of the economy crucially depends on their power, hence the feedback between economics and politics that I mentioned at the beginning, they're not going to be very willing to go along with that sort of change most of the time. Now, I'm of course simplifying things, and in our research and in the book, we try to fill in more of the details. But the picture is more complicated in a number of respects that is important to highlight. The first one is that, I'm talking about historical events. What relevance do these historical events hold for us today? Well, James and I argue in the book a lot for two reasons. First, because when you look around you today, you see other forms of extractive institutions. Perhaps the naked coercion that slavery involved, that the encomienda and the mita system involved, are gone. But still, coercion is around us. If you look at Central Asian republics, such as Uzbekistan, coercion is still part of the production structure. If you look in many parts of Latin America, there is still many coercive practices going on. If you look in the Indian subcontinent, coercion is endemic. But more importantly, explicit coercion may have gone, but the sort of tilted playing field that I talked about is still quite prevalent. So the concept of extractive economic and extractive political institutions is useful precisely because it sort of defines institutions not by their details, but by the functions that they perform. And those functions, extracting resources, that can be performed in a number of different ways. It can be performed by coercion, or it can be performed without coercion by setting up the rules of the economic game in such a way that these rules naturally benefit those who are privileged in society. But the second reason why these historical events are useful for understanding what goes on around us is that current institutions are an outgrowth of these historical institutions. But it's very important to note that this process of persistence is not sort of a static picture. It's not as if the same elite is ruling in Latin America today as it was in the 16th or the 17th century. In fact, both the nature of the elite and the nature of the extractive institutions in Latin America has changed a lot. So the right way to understand the history of institutions and how they shape economic outcomes is to think of a process of path-dependent change. What I mean by path-dependent change is a dynamical process such that things change, but the way things are today influences how things change and in what way they become transformed. And the key point is that extractive institutions, when they change, they often recreate or open the way for the creation of other extractive institutions. And again, let me give you a quick example from Latin America. One of the things that has changed in a major way in Latin America is that all of the colonies gained their independence. The United States became independent at the end of the 18th century. Mexico, one of the other archetypal colonies, the descendants of the Aztecs, and where really the strategies that I've talked about earlier on really got perfected, got its independence in 1820. So you might say, well, 1820, that's only 30 years after the United States, so perhaps after that, Mexico can quickly catch up to the United States. But not so. Let's look at the details a little bit of how Mexico got its independence. Well, in the United States, independence came as a move to make the institutions more inclusive. No taxation, no representation, you might remember. And it came immediately with the Articles of Confederacy and then the U.S. Constitution. The process of institution building continued apace throughout the 19th century. But in Mexico, independence came not as a process of making extractive institutions more inclusive, but as a way of resisting reforming extractive institutions. The main thing that the Mexican elites were afraid and led them to actually declare independence from Spain was that Spain at this time, after the invasion of the peninsula by Napoleon, was going through a process of institutional change. In particular, there were a series of constitutions, starting with the Cadiz Constitution, that started restricting how political power could be exercised. And one of the main things that really exercised the Mexican elites was that that constitution put severe restrictions on coercion in production. So the sort of coercive activities that the Mexican elites got to rely on, they were afraid that wouldn't be allowed anymore. So the Mexican elite declared its independence in order to restructure their extractive institutions, not to make them more inclusive. So you see a process of going from going from a colony to independence. So many details of the institutions change, but the nature, what the functionality of the institutions is, that didn't change so much. But also there were other aspects to this process of extractive institutions recreating themselves. How did independence came in Mexico? Well, it came by some generals representing the elite declaring independence. So it was a military campaign, and these generals took power in the context of very weak institutions that did not put any restrictions on the power of whoever controls the armed force in the society. So what they did is, as soon as they got independence, they declared themselves dictator. Well, when there is a dictator who can really gorge on the resources of the country, that creates a lot of incentives for others to become the dictator. So during the first 30 years of Mexico's independence, there were about 20 changes in who was the dictator and who was the president of the country. And then finally, when the country got stabilized, they had the dictatorship of Porfirio Diaz, who said, okay, fine, we're going to develop the country, but for him, development meant that he gave big grants of land and exclusive use of industry and banking to his friends and let them become very rich. During the same time, the United States was also expanding its frontier. Many new lands became part of the United States. But how did that happen? It happened through land grants or Homestead Acts, which meant that actually those lands went to people in a reasonably equitable manner. Industrialization happened very rapidly in the United States. How did it happen? Well, it happened with free entry. If you look at the background of who the leading industrialists in the United States are during this 19th century, they're nobodies. They're people like Thomas Edison, who are like totally from the lower middle class, have no link to the elite. And what really is remarkable about the United States is that it actually created laws and regulations to make people like this, to make it possible for people like this to actually become major industrialists, to get patents, to get capital, to open factories, and even more importantly, for people like this to actually believe that they could do so. That was obviously totally impossible in Mexico. It was totally impossible in many other parts of the world. Well, that's a very sort of long-term view, obviously. So I've talked a lot about the 19th century. But I want to talk very briefly, before I conclude, about a few other things to bring it to a close. Of course, there are a lot of the details and a lot of more of the historical evidence that we need to weigh in before we can draw a sort of a satisfactory conclusion. But I think a number of things hopefully are sort of clear from this narrative. The first is that the sort of ideas that I started with, the competing hypotheses, geography, culture, enlightened leadership, they're not going to really help us understand these sort of episodes that I've been talking about. Go back to the South versus North America. It wasn't geography that made North America ultimately develop. In fact, if geography has any role, it would have gone the other way around. Because if geography has any role, it means there are some fixed characteristics that make some countries predisposed to become rich. For example, it makes them very productive because they have better soil or they have better irrigation systems, etc. Well, the more productive places were the Aztecs and the Incas. It was the south. They were the ones that had already reached high productivity to support hugely larger populations than the north. And they became much poorer. Why? Because where the population was enabled the setting up of extractive institutions. Was it culture? Well, sure. Spaniards and the English were different. But the culture didn't play much of a role. They had remarkably similar strategies. They tried to do the same thing. When they enslaved people, they treated them the same way. Sure, some were Catholic, some were Protestant, and they said, we're going to try to also convert you to our religion. But it didn't make any difference. They all treated their slaves and their captured people the same way. Was it enlightened leadership? Absolutely not. Who was the enlightened leader here? Well, the enlightened leaders, if any, would have been Pizarro and Cortes. They were the ones who were successful. Sir Thomas Gates and Sir Thomas Dale were totally unsuccessful. So if leadership goes one way, it was, the unsuccessful leaders' country that became richer. And that also is, of course, what you should expect. Because the leaders there were trying to do one thing, set up extractive institutions for their benefit, and at the end, those extractive institutions did not provide the environment upon which economic prosperity would be built. So that's why the unsuccessful leaders were the ones that started the process of institutional change that would later bring prosperity to these parts of the world. But the second conclusion is that even though existing theories are not so useful, the sort of outlines of the theory that I have already given you, that theory is actually pretty attuned to this sort of issues that I'm talking about. Why? Well, because you can see institutions are crucial. And more importantly, the roots of these institutions are not in historical accidents so much, they're not in enlightened leadership, but they are very much in how the politically powerful are or are not able to structure institutions for their benefit. So that's the sense in which we really have to understand how economic and political institutions come together and what their process of change is. And you can see that it really relates to whether the elites can block change, as in Austria-Hungary, as in the Ottoman Empire, as in Russia, as in China, as in India, or whether they are unable to do so, or in some rare circumstances they choose not to do so. But then all of this brings me to the last question that I want to talk about, which is history destiny? So I've talked about the historical roots of institutions. So I've talked about path-dependent change, how institutions change, but their functionality and their implications often remain the same. So does that mean that once you're in extractive institutions, economic or political, you're stuck there, you cannot escape? The answer is no. What is actually quite empowering about the institutional perspective is that what's primitive are the institutions. Institutions themselves have their own dynamics, and those dynamics imply that they can sometimes change, and they change because of the actions that people take. And in fact, history is full of examples of countries turning their institutions from extractive to inclusive, sometimes by quite significant amounts. In fact, all of the more inclusive institutions you see around you, be it in Turkey today, where, of course, institutions are much more inclusive than they were 80 years ago, or in much of Western Europe, or in the United States, or in India, are there because there has been this process of institutional change. But where does that institutional change come from? Well, perhaps it will not be a surprise, given what I have already told you, that that process of institutional change is going to have certain defining features that is again related to the politics of it. In particular, I have defined extractive economic and extractive political institutions as those that are dominated by elites, by politically powerful elites who are able to structure them for their benefit. So then should we expect institutional change to come from the elites who suddenly decide to make political power more evenly distributed, who suddenly decide to make the playing field in the economy more even and more level so that other people benefit? And again, there may be exceptions, but the answer is a big no. Throughout history, the elites, when they have the power, try to structure institutions to benefit themselves. So we're not going to be it's not going to be very meaningful to pin our hopes on them suddenly changing their colors and changing institutions in such a way that's going to benefit them. So in fact, the process of institutional change is almost always conflictual. Conflictual in the sense that institutions become more inclusive not because the elite suddenly wants to grant them, but because the elite is subject to demands that it cannot resist. So in the United States, in the Virginia Company's Jamestown colony, as I've talked about, those demands came from the settlers who said, no, we don't want to work under this draconian labor system that you've designed. We're just going to run away or we're going to refuse it. So those demands were finally met by the Virginia Company's governor and deputy governor by saying, fine, we're going to introduce the head right system. Not before they tried to do it by military force, but once the military force did not work. And in fact, that is a very common pattern. Almost all examples of transition from extractive to more inclusive institutions comes with a lot of conflict. And the bifurcation there is how that conflict is met. And in fact, I think there is no better place to end this talk than to think about one's current specific example of that and think about not only the process of such institutional change, but also the difficulties of that institutional change by turning to the Arab world. Today, the Arab world, in the context of the Arab Spring, or the Middle East and North Africa, is in the midst of major institutional change. That institutional change is very clearly a reaction to very extractive, repressive, authoritarian regimes. Not only in Tunisia against Ben Ali, not only in Egypt against Mubarak, not only in Libya against Gaddafi, not only in Syria against Assad, but all of the discontent in the region is against elites. Elites dominating politics, elites dominating the economy, elites not allowing the rest of the population to take part in social, economic, and political activities on anything approaching a level playing field. How did that play out? Well, it didn't play out by elites granting rights. Mubarak had ruled for over 30 years. Ben Ali ruled over 30 years. Gaddafi ruled over 40 years. The Assad family ruled over 40 years. They did not grant rights. The rights came when the demands became strong enough, when people started going on the streets and demanding political rights, that the process of change started. It's actually quite remarkable that people started demanding political rights. They didn't demand handouts. They didn't demand, more food subsidies. They didn't demand just higher wages. They really were fed up with the system, and I think they were fed up with the system because there was a general understanding, even if people could not articulate it in those words, that the problem was in the politics. It wasn't just in the economy, and that's why they wanted political change. And what was the reaction to those demands? Well, the reaction in all of the cases was, first, exactly as in the Jamestown colony. First, they tried to clamp down on it. Mubarak sent in the thugs, Ben Ali sent in the thugs. But then, in Egypt, it became clear that there was no feasible way of using just repression to end this, because essentially the elite would crack itself, and there would be too many divisions within the elite, for example, between the military and the NDP party that Mubarak and his cronies controlled. And as a result, after a while, there was a relatively smooth transition, perhaps too smooth in the sense that power went from the NDP to the military this time. In Tunisia, the same thing happened. But in Libya and Syria, for example, where the elite was even more monolithic and thought that it had enough military power to control the situation, they actually decided to fight it out rather than make the concessions. And all of these cases also illustrate the pains of institutional change. There is no guarantee whatsoever, and in fact some people might be even more pessimistic than this statement, but there is no guarantee whatsoever that institutions are going to become more inclusive in Libya, Syria, Egypt, or Tunisia. Even in Tunisia and Egypt, where there was a transition without civil war, there are many dangers. The first danger is that, as we have seen just very recently with the laws and the dissolution of the parliament by the military, that the military is going to start dominating society, recreating the same system as the Mubarak had done. And in fact, the military is heavily involved in the economy and was, part of the beneficiaries of a lot of the corruption and entry barriers that existed in the Egyptian economy. But a second possibility is that, exactly as I've hinted at in the context of the Mexican independence, is that one elite is going to be replaced by another elite. So another fear is that, the Mubarak is gone, but there's going to be a Muslim Brotherhood dictatorship and or authoritarian regime this time with the Muslim Brotherhood at the helm, but every bit as non-inclusive against groups that are not allied with the Muslim Brotherhood. So the process is a painful one. The same sort of pains are being witnessed in Syria and worse in Syria, obviously, but in Libya. So the process of institutional change is not an easy one. But there are many examples that show that after this sort of process, once people become mobilized enough and once people become sufficiently involved in politics, the process of institutional change becomes very difficult to reverse. And that's exactly what happened in England, that's exactly what happened in France, that's exactly what happened in the United States, that's exactly what happened in Japan and Botswana and other places. It's not just a European story, but it's a general story of political power becoming more and more equally distributed over time. The fact that it's a historical story means that there is always the shadow of history. But it is about institutions, it's about human choices, and that also means that there is a degree of uncertainty and a degree of unpredictability in it. So it's impossible to say whether in 10 years' time Egypt would be a more stable place than it was 2 years ago. But I think the sort of concepts that I've started giving you a flavor of help us reasoning about these issues in a more systematic manner, and they also start building the bridge between economics and politics, which I think is a very important part of understanding the wealth of nations. Buyurun.
Çok teşekkür ederim. Ben Ali Tekin, Bilkent Üniversitesi Uluslararası İlişkiler Bölümünden. Çok ilginç bir konuşmaydı. Ancak kapsayıcı kurumlardan, daha doğrusu dışlayıcı kurumlardan, yani ekstraktif, galiba Türkçe'de ancak bu kadar.
Inclusive, evet, kapsayıcı güzel.
Evet. Dışlayıcı diye çevirmişler ekstraktifi. Dışlayıcı kurumlardan kapsayıcı kurumlara geçiş konusunda söyledikleriniz belki beni çok fazla ikna etmedi diye düşünüyorum. Yani söylediklerinizin yanlış olduğunu düşündüğümden değil, ama sanki o mekanizma üzerinde daha fazla çalışılabilir gibi geliyor. Mansur Olson diye bir tarihçi, bildiğim kadarıyla kişi var, biliyorsunuzdur belki. Onun hani böyle Olsonian bir kavramı var. Distributive coalitions dediği bir kavram. Şimdi o kavram bakımından baktığı zaman aslında her rejim bir distributive koalisyon anlamına geliyor. bu rejimin değişip yeni bir rejim gelmesi için bu koalisyonun dağılması ve yeni bir koalisyonun ortaya çıkması gerekiyor. Ve bunun için de, bunun olabilmesi için de bazı şartlar olduğunu söylüyor olsun. Bir tanesi savaş, bir tanesi işgal, iç savaş. Belki bunu biz biraz daha yumuşak olarak düşünürsek ekonomik krizler de, büyük krizler de bu tür değişimlere yol açabilir diye algılanabilir. Yani mevcut olan bir rejim ve onun arkasında duran koalisyon bu tür olaylarla değişebilir diye böyle bir argümanı var. Aslında bu argümanın sizin söylediğiniz örneklerde de ben olduğunu düşünüyorum. Türkiye için de çok geçerli olduğunu düşünüyorum. Örneğin 2001 krizi Türkiye'de bence uzun süre egemen olan distribütif koalisyonu dağıttı ve onun yeni politikaları, reformları uygulaması için aslında uygun bir ortam sağladı diye düşünüyorum. Birinci yorumum bu. İkincisi, sizin örneğiniz çok eski dönemlerden, neredeyse ekonomik kalkınmanın, sanayileşmenin başladığı dönemlerden. Benim sorum şu, acaba o dönemde söz konusu olan bir takım mekanizmalar, bir takım dinamikler, ülkelerin bir kısmı zenginleştikten sonra, kalkındıktan sonra, geride kalan ülkeler için acaba ne kadar geçerli? Yani 200 yıl önceki geçerli olan bir reçete, acaba bugün ne kadar geçerli? Ben bu konuda doğrusu büyük şüpheler duyuyorum. Örneğin bugün sizin gerçi makalenizde de belirtiyorsunuz. Çin'in yükselmesi, Güney Kore'nin yükselmesi. Yani bu iki ülkede, Kore son zamanlara kadar çok otoriter bir ülkeydi. Çin hala otoriter bir ülke. Komünist Partisi eliti sonuç olarak yönetiyor. Yani ekonomik olarak bir trickle down denen olay var gibi görünüyor. Buradaki insanlar daha zengin büyük ölçüde. Ama sonuçta siyasi elitlerin kompozisyona baktığımız zaman yine Komünist Partisi'nin Çin'de veya işte belli grupların Kore'de egemen olduğunu görüyoruz. Bu bir çelişki teşkil ediyor mu sizin teoriniz için? Bir de sanıyorum Ocak ayındaydı, Ekonomist dergisinde bir yazı çıktı. İşte devlet öncülüğünde kalkınma tekrar popüler hale geldi tezini işleyen bir makaleydi. Gerçekten de günümüzde kaynakları etkin kullanmak için acaba bir taraftan da merkezileşme olgusu, ekonomik yönetişimin merkezileşmesi olgusu söz konusu değil mi? Bu sizin söylediğiniz siyasi demokratikleşmeyle, ekonomik kalkınmanın bir input olarak siyasi demokratikleşmeyle çelişki içinde değil mi? Acaba bu konularda bir şeyler söyleyebilir misiniz? Çok teşekkür ederim.
Nasıl yapayım ben? Birkaç tane daha soru alayım. Hepsine birkaç tane.
Ben çok kısa sorayım. Bundan sonraki arkadaşlar da biraz daha kısa sorsun ki daha fazla soru şansı olsun. Kanada, Kuzey Amerika'da Kanada örneği konusunda söyleyecek bir şeyim var mı? Bana ilginç gelen bir şey örnek. Çünkü bir koalisyon var orada. İngiliz ve Fransız kurumları koalisyonu. Yani Amerika ile benzerlikler ve farklılıklar anlamında. Bir de Çin, Ali de bahsetti. Tabii. Çin böyle sanki bir önce bir kurumsal yapıdan başka bir kurumsal yapıya geçiyor. Sonra tekrar başka bir kurumsal yapıya geçiyor ve daha böyle hani progresifden daha ya da daha büyüme dostundan daha işte tersi yönde, sonra tekrar büyüme dostu filan. Çin örneği bu anlamda ilginç. Kurumlar nasıl değişiyor bu süreçte ve ne tetikliyor? Tamam. Bunu soracağım.
Bir tane daha alayım, ondan sonra bu üçüne birden yanıt vereyim.
Ben öncelikle teşekkür ediyorum açık aydınlatıcı konuşmanız için. Bu arada bir eski öğrencisi olarak Merih Celasun Hoca'yı da saygıyla anıyorum. Saygıyla andığım bir başka kişi var, Profesör Mansur Olsun. Onun da öğrencisi olma şansına sahip olmuştum. Ve benim Ali Hoca sözü ağzımdan aldı gibi oldu. İlk kısmı aynen benim de değineceğim bir konu. Ama başka bir şeyler de söyleyeceğim. Mansur Olson'un 1960'larda yazdığı tezinde ve 1982 Rise and Decline of Nations kitabında, daha sonra Power Prosperity'de ki tezi, biraz burada İngilizceye döneceğim affınızla, the theory of collective action. Orada, he mentions the formation of interest groups and he inspects those in narrow and encompassing interests. Now, in the dynamics or the evolution of the inclusive and exclusive institutions you're mentioning, I think the important issue is the formation of those narrow interest groups that lead to the exclusive institutions versus the encompassing interests leading to the inclusive institutions. So I think the historical background is extremely important in understanding those evolutions of interest groups, particularly the colonial background, and at the bottom of all of it, geography, of course. And you can, I think there's a lot of insight in those, in understanding today's dynamics even. So thank you very much.
Çok teşekkürler. Birkaç tane konu çıktı burada. Çin ve devlet kalkınmasını, onların ikisini bir arada şey yapayım. Bir de işte kapsayıcı kurumlardan, extractive institution'un Türkçesine emin değilim. Dışlayıcı kurumlardan kapsayıcı. Dışlayıcı tam doğru olmuyor ama hadi öyle yapalım. Geçiş konusunda biraz, bir de olsun ve biraz da Kanada. Şeyden konuşayım önce bir. Çin'den konuşayım. Tabii ben burada kitabın çok az bölümünden bahsedebildim. Ve bazı şeyleri biraz basitleştirdim. Ve özellikle basitleştirdiğim şeyler Çin'le çok ilgili. İki şeyi vurgulamak lazım. Birincisi, bizim kapsayıcı kurumlar dediklerimiz, dışlayıcı kurumlar dediklerimiz hiçbir zaman ekonomik büyümeye yol açacak diye bir şey söz konusu değil. Bizim kitapta söylediğimiz kapsayıcı kurumlar uzun süreli büyümeye yol açmıyorlar. Aslında ve bunu geliştirmek, bu tezi geliştirmek için aslında bundan 10.000 sene öncesine kadar gidiyoruz. Kurumların niteliklerine baktığınız zaman aslında siyasi kudreti elinde tutan insanlar, gruplar bu kudreti her zaman ülkeyi biraz daha zenginleştirmek için kullanmak isteyebilirler. Eğer ülke zenginleşirse kendilerine de daha fazla para olur, kendi güçleri daha fazla artar, yurt dışında, yurt içinde. Niye istemesinler? Bunun nedeni benim başta söylediğim şeylerle ilgili. Bunu yapmak çoğu zaman risklerle geliyor ve bunun getirileri kendilerine olmuyor. Örneğin kim endüstrileşme sürecini yavaşlatmak istedi? Osmanlılar istedi, Rus İmparatorluğu istedi, Avusturya, Macaristan İmparatorluğu istedi. Niye? Çünkü buradaki elitler kendilerinin politik güçlerinin ortadan kalkacağını düşündüler. Ve büyümenin kendilerine getiri getirmeyeceğini düşündüler. Ama eğer bakarsanız başka dönemlere, bazı dönemlerde dünyanın en zengin ülkelerinden bazıları gayet dışlayıcı kurumlar altında. Bunun en güzel örneği belki de Jamaika, Barbados gibi plantation, slave kolonilerinden geliyor. Ve buralar tabii ki yani dışlayıcı kurum dediklerimizin tam örneği. Örneğin Barbados'a bakarsanız %90'ı zenci kökenli köleler, %10 beyaz, çoğu bunların silahlı kuvvetlerde çalışıyorlar ve zorlamak için kullanıyorlar bunu. Ülkenin hemen hemen en önemli toprakları bu zamanlar içinde birkaç ailenin elinde. Bu aileler ekonomiyi, her şeyi kontrol ediyorlar. Ve böyle bir ülkede uzun süreli büyüme olmasını bekleyemezsiniz. Ama bir süre için Barbados dünyanın en zengin ülkelerinden bir tanesiydi. Niye? Çünkü Barbados'un zengin olması için gereken şey şeker büyütmesi. Şeker o zamanlarda çok talebi olan bir ürün. Ve şeker üretmek için de çok o kadar komplike bir şey yapmaya gerek yok. Şeker üreterek çok zengin oldular. Ama Barbados neyi yapamadı? Yapamadığı, şeker üretmekten sonra, şeker ekonomisi düştükten sonra başka bir şeye geçmeyi tamamen başaramadı. Uzun süreli büyüme dediğimiz bu. Yani bir tek bir üründen değil, birçok üründen, birçok şekilde ve özellikle olan teknolojileri değil, teknolojik yaratıcılıkla büyüme. Başka bir örnek daha vereyim ve bu örneği Çin'e bağlayacağım. Çin'den önce, tabii ki şu anda herkes Çin'den bahsediyor ama Çin'den önce çok daha belki insanların Çin'den de fazla çok buldukları, çok çarpıcı buldukları bir örnek vardı. 40 sene çok hızlı büyüyen bir ülke ve herkes bu ülkenin ne kadar süper bir sistemi olduğundan bahsediyoruz o zaman. Sovyet Rusya. 1928'den 1960'ların sonuna ya da 70'lerin başına kadar Sovyet Rusya Amerika'dan, İngiltere'den, Fransa'dan çok daha hızlı büyüdü. Ve bu süreç içinde birçok insan bu sistemin çok daha iyi bir sistem olduğundan falan bahsetmeye başladı. Ama nasıl büyüdü Sovyet Rusya? Tabii ki yine benim burada dışlayıcı kurumlar dediğim şeyler. Private property ile hiçbir alakası yok. Her şey command economy ile oluyor. Politik olarak tüm kudret partinin elinde. Ama bunun büyümesinin nedeni bizim ekonomide catch-up growth dediğimiz şey. Yani teknolojiyi alıp özellikle tarımdan endüstriye insanların çok hızlı bir şekilde geçmesini sağlayıp ve bu endüstriye talep yaratıp büyümeye başladı. Ve bu türlü catch-up growth, yani yurt dışında olan teknolojiyi alıp da yapılan catch-up growth gerçekten çok hızlı bir şekilde gidebilir. Ama Rusya'nın da gösterdiği ki bir tek bu catch-up growth'la çok zengin olunmaz. Rusya'nın yapamadığı çok yeni teknolojiler üretmek idi. Ve yeni teknolojiler üretemediği için, özellikle yeni ürünler üretemediği için 1970 senelerinden başlayarak Rus ekonomisi çok büyük bir sıkıntıya girdi ve tamamen ortadan kalktı bir ekonomi olarak 1980'lerin sonlarına doğru. Ve bu perspektif bence Çin için çok uygun. Yani Çin, Rusya ile aynı değil. Çin'in ekonomisinde çok büyük ekonomik reformlar oldu. Çünkü Çin'de bundan 300 milyon insan fakirlikten orta tabakaya geçtiyse bunun en büyük nedeni tarım sektöründe tamamen hiç property rights, hiç modern üretim olmadığı zamanda 1978'den başlayarak çok önemli reformlar oldu. Bu reformlar insanların piyasa için üretmeye başlamalarını ve ürettiklerinin birazını kendilerinin kazanabildikleri için bu şeye yatırma yapmalarına kaynaklanıyor. Ama buna rağmen Çin son 20 sene içinde bizim dışlayıcı kurumlar altında büyüme dediğimiz sisteme çok uyuyor. Ve bu sistem bu catch-up growth potential, yurt dışından gelen teknoloji potansiyelini bitirdiği anda çok büyük problemlere giriyor. Ve bunu konuştuğumuz zaman bu tabii bir senede, 2 senede olacak bir şey değil. Çin şu anda hala Amerika'nın %15'inden daha düşük gayri safi milli hasıla kişi başına düşen ve başka bu tür catch-up growth'ların, industrialization based catch-up growth'ların sona ermelerine bakarsanız, örneğin Brezilya'da falan olan şeyler 1960'lar 70'lerde bunlar özellikle %30 kişi başına düşen milli hasıla seviyesine geldiğinde zorluklar yaşamaya başlıyorlar. Yani bu durumda Çin'in sistemi belki de bir 5-10 sene daha devam edebilir ama özellikle Çin'de daha derin reformlar olmadığı sürece ve özellikle bu reformlar hem ekonomide hem genel toplumda çok daha elit dışında, çok daha genel taban içinde insanların ekonomik ve sosyal etkinliklere girmelerini sağlamadığı sürece problemler ortaya çıkacak. Kanada konusuna gelince, Kanada aslında çok enteresan. Çin'den bayağı bahsediyoruz kitapta. Kanada'dan pek o kadar bahsetmiyoruz. Ama Kanada'nın enteresan olmasının bir nedeni aslında Kanada şeyi gösteriyor. Yani Kanada'nın tarihine bakarsanız ki yani kitapta olmadığı için çok o kadar dikkatli bir şekilde okumadım ama Amerika'dan çok değişik. Örneğin dediğiniz gibi bir ülkenin kolonisi değil. Fransa ve İngiliz bir arada. Katolik, Protestan bir arada. İngiltere'ye karşı hiçbir zaman ortaya şey yapmadı, savaşmadı. Örneğin Amerika'da savaşla bir bağımsızlık oldu. Kanada'da bu böyle olmadı. Kanada hatta loyalistlerin gittiği yer. Ama buna rağmen Kanada'nın trajektorisi Amerika'ya çok benziyor. Niye? Çünkü sonuçta kurumlar tamamen dışlayıcı bir şekilde değil, yine de oradaki insan, yine de orada native population olmamasından kaynaklanıyor. Yine Amerika'daki gibi. Avrupalıların kendilerinin gidip de yaşayacağı bir toplum haline gelmesi için çalıştıkları bir yer olduğu için kurumların çok daha değişik bir gelişme yolları var ve bu nedenden dolayı çok daha değişik bir kurumsal çizgisi var ve bu çizginin sonucu olarak. Tabii bugün Kanada ile Amerika arasında çok önemli değişiklikler var. Bugün Kanada ile Amerika ile İsveç arasında çok büyük değişiklikler var. Bunları da anlamak önemli. Ama genelde nasıl ben tüm dışlayıcı kurumlar functionality olarak birbirlerine bayağı benziyorlar. Detayları değişik desem de aynı şey biraz da İsveç, Kanada, Amerika için de geçerli. Tabii bunları ben bu değişiklikleri minimize etmek istemiyorum. Örneğin İsveç'in çok daha sosyal devleti çok önemli bir sistem. Ama İsveç ile Amerika arasındaki paraleller örneğin Amerika ile ve İsveç ile Türkiye arasındaki değişikliklerden çok daha fazla. Konusuna gelince kurumsal değişim süreci çok uzun yanıt vermek istemiyorum. Dediğinize tamamen katılıyorum. Bu konuda çok araştırma olması lazım. Zaten ben bu kitaptaki hiçbir yazdığımız bu son söz değil ve ben burada çok az söyledim. Ama aslında bu bizim bayağı düşündüğümüz bir şey. James Robinson'la benim bundan önceki kitabım Economic Origins of Dictatorship and Democracy aslında tüm bu politik değişim süreci içindeydi ve o kitabı da alırsanız, bu kitabı da alırsanız ben yine de tamamen size katılıyorum. Bilmemiz gerekenin %10'u bile değil. Ama biraz bu konuda bir şey var. Bizim kitabımızdan da çıkan, başka şeylerden çıkan belli bir literatür var. Ve literatürde hem teorik olarak hem empirik olarak dediklerinizde bazı şeyler var. Krizlerin örneğin çok büyük önemi var. Çünkü krizler dışarıdan gelen ya da içeriden gelen krizler olan rejimleri zayıflatıyorlar ve yani bu zayıflıklar çok önemli. Bir şey değil yani sonuçta bir sürpriz değil ki Mısır'da ve Suriye'de ve Libya'da bu olaylar hemen Tunus'un arkasından patladı. Yani o zayıflıktan kaynaklanan şeyler. Ve sonunda Manchur Olson konusunda tabii ki Manchur Olson, ben dedim size en başta dedim we're building on the shoulders of giants. Manchur Olson, Douglas North, bazı bu konularda yazan ekonomik historianlar vardı ve bunların yaptıkları çok önemli şeyler ve biz bunlardan çok yararlandık. Tabii ki dediğiniz gibi detaylarına baktığınız zaman birçok değişiklikler var. Özellikle bizim koyduğumuz vurgu politik siyasi kurumlar ve bu siyasi kurumların değişmesi üzerine Manchur Olson'un kurduğu vurgu daha çok collective action ve rigidification of existing interest groups ve bu interest group dynamics bazı farklar var. Douglas North'la da bazı farklar var ama Douglas North'da olsun, Manchur Olson'da olsun genelde bizim geliştirdiğimiz tezle gayet ilintili ve onların yaptıklarından yararlandığımız kesinlikle doğru. Lütfen.
Sorry, we are only taking questions from this side of the audience. I apologize, I don't speak Turkish and I'm not an economist. I'm an English-speaking physicist. The great professor that we are celebrating here, he says that the strength of the model is in its flexibility. And that's my question on your narrative. I granted that I have not read your book, but from what you said, what I question is the purity of your argument. I think as far as flexibility is concerned, if you look back in the history, there are many examples, in fact more so of those examples than the pure example that you have quoted, where you see multiple institutions existing together and sustaining, at least for a while. All those societies have disappeared in many ways. I think, for example, the political extractivity combined with economical inclusivity is something that we see all over the place. You can take example of Rome, where they would build a political system isolated geographically but yet politically dependent on Rome, but giving total economic flexibility. And we have talked about China a lot, and I would like to throw in that soup Turkey, and I hope that you could comment on that.
Okay, let me give you a quick answer. I'll give you some quick answer because since you're not a Turkish speaker, I'll answer this one in English. Yes, you're absolutely right. And in fact, I've simplified things again by picking an example where you can really draw a very sharp distinction between extractive and inclusive institutions. In reality, it's shades of gray, and in fact, what we do in the book, we talk a lot about how different inclusive and extractive institutions cohabit and they support each other. For example, in places such as Colombia today, you see, part is an extractive, inclusive core, but parts of it are very highly extractive under the controls of armed groups and how they support each other. And this matters a lot greatly for the dynamics of these institutions. And in fact, the example we use in the book to make some of these points is exactly the Roman Empire, especially after the collapse of the Republic, which is kind of a system that has both inclusive and extractive elements. And that's, we spent a chapter on that talking about this. Now let me go back to Turkish to take a couple more questions. I think we have about 5 minutes or so. So 5 dakika falan kaldı. Ben 2-3 soru daha alayım ve onlara hızlı bir yanıt vereyim.
Araştırmaları Merkezi. Özbekistan'da bir atasözü var. Der ki, ölevinde herkes kendi ölüsüne ağlar. Şimdi biz de buraya gelirken aslında Türkiye'yi düşünerek geldik. Belki çoğunluğumuz öyle geldi. Sizin bu kitabınızdan Türkiye için dersler nedir? Bunları bir öğrenebilirsek çok sevineceğiz gün bitmeden.
I will ask my question in English. Sorry about that. I'm Merih Celasun'u, junior economist at ILO. I would like to hear your thoughts on the role of informal institutions on economic development. To what extent the formation of social capital and civil society via religious bonding, such as what's currently happening in Turkey, contributes positively to the growth of economies? And might informal institutions dominate the role of formal institutions that are more difficult to change and that are path-dependent?
Efe Savaş, Bilkent Üniversitesi doktor öğrencisiyim. Müsaadenizle terminolojik mesele nedeniyle ben de İngilizce sormak istiyorum. What I want to ask is the way you theorize institutional change in your model. What I'm particularly curious about is the moment in which initial trigger is pulled for the institutional change, which is identified in your model as institutional drift, and which sets the stage for subsequent critical junctures and revolutions and so on. As it's stressed in your model, when relative powers of institutional actors once start to change, subsequent revolutions will likely to follow. However, what I want to ask is, under what conditions that initial institutional drift can occur so that later incremental change become possible? Is it the internal characteristics of the institutions? For example, can we say that some institutions are less path dependent, so more conducive to change? Or do you think, is it possible or indeed necessary to develop a relational model as an alternative to institutionalist model? And what I mean by relational model is a process where actors' behaviors and preferences are not constrained or shaped by institutions, but instead by the conditional upon the decisions and power of the actors, other actors that they encounter during the making of institutions. Thank you.
Şimdi 2 tane İngilizce, 1 tane Türkçe soru olunca ben şöyle yapayım. Çok çabuk bir İngilizce soruya yanıt vereyim İngilizce, ondan sonra Türkçe soruya yanıt vereyim. No secret. So very briefly, I think both questions actually are related, and they're related to issues that go beyond institutions. In the book we try to sort of give more details about, along the lines of what you've talked about, which I did not have any time to talk about, institutional drift, critical junctures, and the process of institutional change in a somewhat richer section way than it is that I've been able to do here, and also about informal institutions. I mean, institutions are not just what's written in the Constitution. That often doesn't mean anything. It's all about political power. But it's also about people's beliefs and how that functions. And all of those are very important things. We only talk a little bit about both of these issues, which are sort of current research questions. But I think that the two are related. I mean, in some sense, informal institutions, both in the way that political power is exercised in society outside the centralized state, and also beliefs, are often very difficult to change. But I also think that sometimes we exaggerate how difficult to change they are. For example, look at China. People would have said in the 1970s, China has a particular work culture that cannot be changed. It's shaped by the Cultural Revolution. It's shaped by the Great Leap Forward. It's changed by hundreds of years of Confucian teaching, and it's all changed. Cultural Revolution still has a long shadow in China. It shapes the way that people interact with the market economy, but it hasn't persisted in that way. So I think some of that is very difficult to see unless you actually see it play out, and that's, I guess, is a weakness of this sort of theorizing, but that's the reality we're dealing with. And I think that also relates to your question, which is that, in some cases there are crucial elements that only become clear once we actually start understanding the details. So in the English example, which I think you were implicitly referring to, there really is many elements, such as the development of private property in land or in a specific form, small holders in society, even as the large landowners were alive, and certain sort of legal precedents going back to Magna Carta. And it is quite possible that they've played even more of a role than we emphasize in the book. And you can analyze them in an institutional or relational model. I think at the end they're all sort of working together. I mean, the relational elements are part of an institutional story, as I would like to sort of articulate it, but obviously in the book we've sort of cut that part a little bit short. And at the end I'll just say a few things about Turkey in Turkish. Beyefendi bundan önce sorduğunda şeyi de söyledi. Bazı örnekler verdi. Hem kapsayıcı hem dışlayıcı kurumların birlikte olduğu. Türkiye'de aynı bu şekilde. Türk Cumhuriyeti'nin doğduğundan beri Türkiye'de benim anladığım kadarıyla kapsayıcı ve dışlayıcı kurumlar hep bir arada. Türkiye 20. yüzyılın başında büyük bir modernleşme yaşadı. Ama bu modernleşme tabandan gelen bir modernleşme değil, daha çok dışarıda, yukarıdan verilen bir modernleşmeydi. Ve böyle şeylerde tabii ki kimin elinde politik kuvvet olursa o daha fazla güçleniyor. Ve Türkiye'de bu tabii Türkiye'nin büyük bir kesiminin hem politik hayattan, hem sosyal hayattan, hem ekonomik hayattan tamamen faydalanmaması anlamına geldi. Ve tabii ki bu sistem askerinin ekonomi ve siyasetteki rolüyle de tamamen alakalı. Türkiye'de demokrasiye doğru adımlar son 15 sene içinde daha fazla hızlandı. Ve bu kolay bir süreç değil. Mısır'da, Libya'da, Tunus'ta ne kadar zor olduğundan bahsettim. Bir tek orada değil, Fransa'da Fransız devrimi çok net bir olay. Ama Fransız devriminden sonra 60 sene sürdü Fransa'nın demokratik ve istikrarlı bir politik düzeyinin gelişmesi. Türkiye'de de bu çok yavaş bir süre olacak ve bu süre içinde birçok riskler var. Ve Türkiye'de dediğim gibi demokrasiye doğru atışlı adımlar atılıyor. Çünkü bir askerinin ve özellikle politik ve askeri gücün odaklandığı bir şeyin politikadan çıkması bunun için çok önemli. Ama askerler çıktı, onun yerine bir tane demokratik bir şekilde seçilmiş bir hükümet geldi diye bu Türkiye'nin de ne demokratik olduğu anlamına gelir ne kapsayıcı kurumları olduğunu anlamına gelir. Venezuela'da da Hugo Chavez demokratik olarak seçildi. Ondan sonra ne yaptı Hugo Chavez? İlk yaptığı şey kendi bir term daha almasını sağladı. Ondan sonra parlamentoyu kudretini bayağı azalttı. Ondan sonra bir sürü hem politik hem ekonomik olarak bir sürü ekonomiyi çökertecek davranışlarda bulundu. Bu böyle içinde çok problemler, divided society dediğimiz kurumlarda demokratikleşme süreci içinde bir partinin, bir insanın gücü daha çok eline alıp ve bu gücü giderek daha çok kullanıp kapsayıcı kurumları zayıflatma riski her zaman var. Türkiye'de bu riski nasıl karşılayacak? Bu çok önemli. Askeri ortadan çıktıktan sonra onun yerine yeni bir otoriteryen ve yeni kapsayıcı olmayan ama değişik bir şekilde dışlayıcı olan kurumlar mı ortaya çıkmaya başlayacak? Yoksa gerçekten 2000'lerin başında gerçekten çok umutlu olduğumuz bir şekilde demokratik kurumlar giderek kuvvetlenmeye devam edecekler mi? Bunlar bence ekonominin geleceği için şu anki faizin ya da şu anki cari açığın ne olduğundan çok daha önemli. Ve orada da bitirelim.